What's going on, friends? If you're looking at used Harley-Davidson motorcycles, there are a lot of factors to consider before you throw down your money on a good used bike. Now, one thing that always comes up on a used motorcycle is you can always find something within your price point. But if what you're finding in your price point isn't actually a good bike. Case in point, when it comes to finding a bike within a lower price point, it's always the mileage on a bike. Just how many miles are too many miles to consider when you're buying a used Harley-Davidson. Now, the other factor to consider is what are you willing to replace and what are you willing to deal with. It is no secret that a well taken care of Harley-Davidson motorcycle can run well over 100,000 miles. The problem is when you're buying a used bike, this is a total and complete unknown. Sometimes you get lucky, you find a 1-2 owner motorcycle, and they have a litany of paperwork documenting every little thing done to it, maybe even right down to when they wash the bike and lube the cables. Now, one thing that you can do is you can take that VIN number, you can go to a Harley-Davidson dealership, have them run that VIN number, and if at any point in time that bike had any work done at a Harley dealership, they're going to be able to give you some service history on it. Is it absolutely foolproof? It's not. But it does give you some direction to go on, especially if the bike has already got a butt ton of miles on it. Now, as I mentioned, when it comes to mileage, that's really a judgment call. But at some point, you've got to kind of outweigh the pros and cons as far as what does this bike cost, what year is it, and how many miles does it have on it, and basically, how many more miles can I expect to get out of it before I'm going to actually have to do some major repairs on the bike. Now, personally, I like higher mileage motorcycles, especially if I go out to look at one. I can start it, I can ride it, I can get a good feel for the bike, listen to it. Yeah, it may have some miles on it, but at the same time, I still feel like, hey, this is going to be a really good bike for me. This is something I can get into cheap, ride it and enjoy it for a while, and turn around and sell it. Or if I really like it, some miles pile on it, might just decide to tear it down and go through it, do a little preventive maintenance. While we're in there, go ahead and freshen it up a little bit. Those are some things that you really want to consider. A lot of times with a high mileage bike, it really is a roll of the dice. But we want to consider what is high mileage on a Harley. Well, that really comes down to the maintenance. There's a big difference in 20,000 miles on a bike that's been road hard and hung up wet versus 60,000 miles on a bike that's been basically ridden kindly and taken care of with loving care. The pitfall with buying a high mileage bike is there's a lot of things that you're going to want to consider other than just the condition of the engine. There's a lot of other things that are going to wear on the motorcycle, and I'm not just talking tires and brakes. For one, you definitely want to check out the wheel bearings. You got a lot of miles on them. Those wheel bearings, they do wear out. They do get loose over time. That's a very obvious thing to find. Of course, if you're riding the bike, you're going to notice pretty quick. What about the steering stem? When was the last time it had a fall-away test and adjustment done on it? This is very important because these are all things that lead into what we call the Harley wobble, and I've done a couple of videos on the Harley wobble and some things you could do to correct it if you've done everything else I'm about to mention, but that's kind of a last resort with going with a stabilizer. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to consider on a high mileage bike, especially if it's a rubber mounted engine. If you've got a touring bike or a Dyna, they all have the rubber mounts on them. Those rubber mounts, they do wear out. That is something you're going to want to look at. And trust me, if you get a bike that's actually got a broken mount in it or one that's already wore out, you're going to know real quick riding that bike. Another thing to consider is the swing arm bushings. This is another area that really contributes to the Harley wobble. From the factory, these are rubber. They do wear out over time. They get hard, they weather crack, they come apart, they lead to bad handling. You go into a corner, next thing you know, that bike's starting to buck and twist and try to throw you off of it. Another thing you're going to want to consider is that just comes with age and with mileage. So I think you're already starting to see kind of some of the things I'm going to want you to look at if you're looking at buying a bike that's definitely an older motorcycle, and also, not only that, if it's got a lot of miles on it. You could get a later model that's got a ton of miles on it for a lot less money than new, but don't get yourself into a position where this bike already needs a bunch of updates and repairs done to it that you weren't really considering when you went to look at the bike. Definitely consider your cables. If it's not a hydraulic clutch or throttle-by-wire bike, you're going to want to check out your throttle cables, your clutch cables. You want to make sure those are in good condition. Unfortunately, unless there's no visual cues or you can't really feel anything in it, that just kind of leaves it up to, you're just basically left up to chance. You're just going to have to ride it. I mean, personally, if you can, go ahead and replace the cables on it. It's something quick and easy, cheap to do. It'll save you a lot of headache, because the last thing you want to do is buy a high mileage Harley-Davidson, get it all serviced up, and then actually try to take a trip on it somewhere, and then lose a clutch or a throttle cable out there on the road somewhere. That makes for a really bad day. Now, with high mileage Harley-Davidsons, the other things we really want to look at is definitely the engine, obviously. We want to consider what's going on with the engine. Make sure that that bike is absolutely cold when you go to look at it. You guys probably already know that, but for not only for noise, but just to kind of listen to how it starts. Does it start up really quickly? Is it really hard to start? If it's really hard to start and it's constantly rotating over and over and over again, that bike could actually be trying to build compression to fire. That right there is a really negative sign. And if the seller will let you, I would actually run a compression test on it right then and there. It's really quick and easy to do, and it'll tell you a lot about what's going on with the engine. Now, on the flip side of that, obviously, once you get the bike started, you're going to be listening for any knocks, pings, unusual noises, the yada yada yada, the normal stuff. But when the bike's hot, that's the other thing you want to look at too, is try and do a hot start on it. Evaluate how that bike starts when it's hot. If it's really hard to start hot, could have a weak battery, could be a bad starter, we could have something else going on a little more serious within the engine. So as you're running through all this and you're looking at this bike and you're checking this out, you're making these mental notes, kind of keep in the back of your mind, is this something that I'm willing to fix? Am I willing to deal with this later on down the road? Another thing to consider if the bike's got a lot of miles on it is what are the conditions of your fork seals? What is the condition of the clutch? What is that condition of that primary chain tensioner in there? Yes, it has a tensioner pad in there. They do wear out as well. Has it been over-tightened over the years from an automatic tensioner? Definitely things you're going to want to think about and consider. It's just one of those things that is just so unknown about these bikes. Now, unless you're buying from a reputable dealer, and sometimes I'm saying not even reputable dealers actually go into a lot of detail on these motorcycles. Not saying buying a bike with a lot of miles on it is a bad thing, but just be aware there's a lot of things you're going to want to look at before you actually take this bike out on the road and really trust it far away from home. So what constitutes high miles and what should I be looking for? Well, it depends on the year of the bike and the motor that's in it. Twin cam 88, anything from 99 to 01, I'm going to consider 15,000 miles right there just because of the cam chain tensioners. If you've got anything less than that on that bike, definitely do it. But when it comes to a 99 to 2001, that is for sure 100% you're going to be cracking the cam chest. You want to look at those tensioners. You want to see where you're at. Same thing on anything from 2003 to 2006. The problem isn't as bad on those, but it's still a good idea to inspect those chain tensioners. Now, if you've got an 06 Dyna or newer, I'm not too worried about that with the hydraulic tensioner system. I do like to check those out between 30 and 40,000 miles because most generally, you could get 50,000 miles out of a set of the hydraulic tensioners. So that's just definitely something you want to think about there. To me, about 50,000 miles on the twin cam, that's kind of about the upper echelon of the mileage that I'm willing to purchase a bike at. Normally, when it comes to a used bike, especially in the twin cam, I'm looking at anywhere between 25 and 50,000 miles. Generally, that range is kind of what I consider a little bit up there in mileage. And we're getting up there in that kind of mileage. I'm really looking at what year is it, how much are they asking for it, and then just the overall condition of the bike. That really helps me kind of make a decision on there when it comes to a twin cam. Now, Evos, really, the only thing about the Evo I can say is just that inner cam bearing, depending on the year, whether it's an INA or maybe it's been swapped to a Torrington. But once again, that's another thing we don't know unless we tear the bike apart. But generally with Evos, I'm not really too worried about high mileage on those bikes, just simply before the parts availability and basically the cost to actually rebuild one of those motors. And generally, there's not a whole lot that's going to come apart in there and thrash the engine. The only thing on the Evo that I'm really concerned about is somewhere between 30 and 40,000 miles on those bikes is what is the conditions of the lifters. If I'm looking at one of those bikes that's got about 40,000 miles on it, I'm definitely doing a set of lifters in it, unless they can prove to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that it has absolutely been done through paperwork. And even if they got the paperwork, I'm going to go to the shop and be like, did you do this work? Now for Milwaukee 8s, Milwaukee 8 motors, these things have actually done pretty darn well. we've seen them go up to 100,000 miles pretty handily. Now, usually by 100,000 miles, when you get into these motors, you start tearing them down. You find a lot of things that I would say would be undesirable, but that just kind of comes with age, and there's really nothing you can do about it. That's just kind of the cost of having fun at that point. But as far as Milwaukee 8s go, I like to keep it about between 30 to 40,000 miles on those bikes. Buy one at about that mileage range. If you can pick it up cheap enough, you've still got years and years and years and plenty of miles you can put on the bike without really having to make a major repair or get into basically rebuilding a top end on them. So guys, I've told you what I kind of consider high mileage for a Harley-Davidson, especially one that I'm purchasing, but I want to know your thoughts. What do you consider high mileage on a Harley-Davidson engine? Some people might say 20,000 miles is too many miles, and some people might say it's 60,000 miles, it's just getting broke in. But honestly guys, at the end of the day, it just depends on how that bike was taken care of. But again, when it comes to a used Harley-Davidson, it is very hard to discern how well that bike was taken care of unless there's a litany of paperwork, which is pretty rare these days. But anyhow guys, let me know in the comments, what do you consider high mileage on a Harley-Davidson engine? But anyhow guys, that's all I've got for you this week. If you guys enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But until next week guys, you stay safe on the streets, ride smart, dodge those cars, and I'll catch you guys back here next week with a brand new video. Thanks for watching.